Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. My guest for this show is Matthew Mcwilliams. He's an expert on authoritarianism. He's the author of the book on fascism, 12 Lessons for American History. He's a longtime political professional, establishing MacWilliams Sanders Communications, a campaign and issues-driven media strategy firm more than 20 years ago. And he's fighting authoritarianism internationally. His website is MatthewMcWilliams.com. That's M-A-C Williams. And here's his book on fascism, 12 Lessons for American History. It's well dog-eared and marked up by me, which was a pleasure to do. So
Thank you.
Great to have you on the show.
It's great to be on your show. Thank you for having me, and I really look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, so this was a really good read. I mean, I went through it. I don't always do that, but it takes you right through. It's short and it covers a lot of ground. And as I told you right before we got on the air, I at one point in reading the book, I said I should ask the question, what are the worst examples of fascism and authoritarianism? And then I realized that's what this book does. It shows the worst, most horrendous, monstrous examples of fascism and authoritarianism that happened in the United States, perpetrated by presidents, by progressives, by the Supreme Court, by attorney generals. It's horrible.
Yeah, it is amazing. I felt privileged to be able to write it. Because I knew some of this history, but not all of it. But when you dig into it, it churns your stomach, what you learn. And, there's some other examples. I probably could have done 15 or 20, but these are the 12 that really struck me because they're in different parts of American history and different aspects of what we care about so much in this country, our Enlightenment aspirations. But I think it should really make people think and rethink our history and how we look at it. And that's what I was hoping to do with the book.
My first question is usually, what's your goal for this book?
Yeah, it was it was twofold. One was to give context to what's happening right now and to say it's a very bad version of what's happened in the past, but we've seen this in the past. And then it was also to push people, to urge people to confront and reconcile our history. Because my feeling is, if we want to reach a more perfect union and really attain the aspirations of the Declaration and the Constitution, we have to examine our history and reconcile it. And quite frankly, that's what, if we're focusing on Trump right now, he doesn't want to have happen. The Trump 1776 Commission is to whitewash and sanitize history. We need to confront our history of systemic racism. We need to confront our history of how we've treated people, how we've dealt with the First Amendment, and we have to reconcile it. And that's the only way I think we can progress. That's really our job as Americans. But we have to reconcile history to do it. So that's why I wrote the book.
And in the book, throughout the book, you give statistics of how these huge percentages of Americans support all these fascist ideas.
Yeah, it's there's data from my surveys that I've been doing with two other professors, one at Tufts, one at the University of Massachusetts. So there's current data from panel surveys, which is in the Authoritarian Index of Americans, and how there are, great numbers of people, surprising percentages of people who agree with these very authoritarian concepts. But also what I thought was really fascinating was, polling hasn't been around for too long, but you can go back and look at Gallup surveys and see, like on lynching, data on what people thought about the Federal Lynching Act back in the 30s, how they felt about Jews during World War II, and even today, how they feel about conspiracy theories like Pizzagate. So there's all this other data out there that really, when you look at it, it's really quite surprising.
And so you have data that says that 18% of Americans are strong authoritarian, and another 23% are easily persuaded or led to embrace authoritarian ideas.
Yeah,
Did I get
these
that
are
right?
yeah, these are the sort of the key groups of people who are most likely to be activated by the rhetoric of an authoritarian, a strongman rhetoric, by fear mongering. And these are the folks who are most likely to be activated. And it's not, that data comes right from the polls I did 2017 up until we have a poll going in the field right now. Um, but it's not new. I mean, there have been people researching this way of looking at authoritarianism in the United States since '92. And it's really very similar to what Mark Hetherington, Jonathan Weiler found in their book, Authoritarianism and Polarization in American Politics. So this data is not an outlier. A key sort of caveat is just because you score high on the scale doesn't mean you're an authoritarian. It's predictive, probabilistic of that behavior, but it's not deterministic.
Okay, so
Uh,
I need to get a definition of authoritarianism and fascism, and how are they related to each other? The title of the book is Fascism, but there's a lot of discussion in the book about authoritarianism.
yeah, and the reason I do that is that we can't measure fascism. At least we don't have a survey questions to do that, but we can measure authoritarianism. And when you look at authoritarianism, a way to define it, it's the taproot of fascism. It's also the taproot of sexism, hostile sexism, racism, othering, a series of other sort of fellow travelers in that grouping. So authoritarianism is the taproot. It's been around forever. I mean, it is a disposition that people have. Part of it is you're born with it. Part of it is learned. It's nature and nurture. Um, and fascism is really the far right authoritarian ultranationalism that we found characterized, in 20th century Europe. Uh, the key things to know about what authoritarians think and how they differ in their thinking than we do. Like authoritarians choose authority, obedience, and uniformity over what we would choose, or I would choose, freedom, independence, and diversity. That's why one of the first books on authoritarianism, which was written as a response to fascism, Eric Fromm's book, is called Escape from Freedom. Authoritarians, when they are scared, frightened, when they've been activated, they go to escape from freedom. And one of the sort of gateway drugs for that is being activated by fear. And so, how do you make people afraid? You make them afraid of others. So, othering becomes a key part of this. The authoritarian leader selects another, says they're different than us, and then runs against them. It creates an us versus them division in society. And, we see this today clearly. Um, so those are the key sort of differences between authoritarians and people who aren't.
Okay, that's a so now I will always think that there are two kinds of authoritarians. There's the one that says you're going to do this,
Yep.
and then there are the 10,000 who say, please tell me what to do.
Yeah. You're right. There's the leader, the self-interested man or woman. That self-interested man or woman's enablers, and then there are the followers. So there is the difference. The leader taps into that, activates those other people, and they follow. Um, if you go back in our history, I think one of the things that I found to be the most interesting was Madison's article in Federalist Paper 63. And Madison talked about this. The Federalist Papers were written to promote the ratification of the Constitution, and Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers about the infection of the violent passions, that's authoritarianism, by self-interested men. And he knew, and the founders knew, Madison, Jay, and Hamilton writing these things, knew that that was a problem that any democracy faced. And they tried to build a constitutional structure to protect us from that. But over the time, a lot of the structures that they put in to stop the demagogue, just first the scope of the country itself, those have been supplanted by our communications and other ways of reaching people. Now that everyone's town hall is in their back pocket, it's easy for an authoritarian to reach out, activate people.
And as you say in the book, the net, the web has really taken away the power of some of the things that the Constitution and the amendments put in place to prevent that kind of thing.
Yeah, it definitely has. It's just, one of the things that protected the country was the scope of the country, but the net allows you to go to reach beyond that scope. It makes geography not important. And
now you have, go ahead.
Yeah, and you really saw that first. That's the one chapter on the rise of hate radio, Father Coughlin. He was the first one who was able to go and reach out across the country with a message of hate. And he monetized it. And he showed fear mongers, hate mongers, conspiracy mongers how to make money spewing hate.
And the hate that he spewed was kind of support for the Nazis and anti-Semitism primarily.
Yeah, it started out a little bit different than that, but it morphed into that very, very strongly. I mean, he was at the end supporting or promoting the protocols of the elders of Zion, even, which is just nutball conspiracy theory that had been debunked decades before. Only Henry Ford believed in it. The Nazis loved it, and he was talking about that on radio to millions of Americans, and also had it in his publication, which is named Social Justice.
What was interesting was that you point out that he was getting 22% of the listeners, and his listeners, there were like 40 million of them.
Yeah,
and that's different compared to Sean Hannity getting 2 or 3%.
Yeah, the footprint of Father Coughlin was gigantic compared to Hannity, just gigantic.
Yeah, those were the early days, and the power was immense. So you have 5 questions to identify authoritarians. What are those 5 questions?
And I always forget them, so I keep them written down. But 4 of them are child-rearing questions. And the reason it's important to have child-rearing questions is that they do have nothing to do with political behavior or really authoritarianism, you would think, but they're predictive of people taking authoritarian actions or supporting authoritarian actions. So they are, which qualities is it more important for a child to have? Respect for elders or independence? Respect for elders, that's the authoritarian answer. Self-reliance or obedience? Obedience is the authoritarian answer. Good manners or curiosity? Good manners, authoritarian answer. And being considerate or being well-behaved? And well-behaved would be the authoritarian answer. And you can go right onto my website and you'll see those questions. You can fill them out and find your authoritarian score very quickly. And what's critical about these questions is that the people who answer them, we get a scale of people from non-authoritarian to authoritarian. And then we look at what we would consider to be authoritarian behaviors, supporting a strong leader. For example, there's a poll question. I'm more likely to agree that my country should be governed by a strong leader who doesn't pay attention to Congress or elections. What we find is the people who score high in the authoritarian scale are statistically much more likely to support that anti-democratic notion. A strong leader is going to not pay any attention to elections, not going to pay any attention to Congress, than non-authoritarians. And on issue after issue after issue, these simple 4 questions predict support for attitudes that are, we look at as Americans as how can you possibly believe in that? They're more likely to think the president for example, we're thinking in terms of presidential power, should have the power to limit the voice and vote of opposition parties. They're more fearful of other people. They're more likely to agree that increasing diversity in this country is a clear and present threat to security.
And you mentioned in the book that that's like the extra question that helps to identify people as authoritarian. Are some groups inferior to others?
Yeah, that's the fifth question. These four questions have been asked in U.S. polling since 1992. And they come out of the Frankfurt School of Germany and Eric Fromm. They've been developed since then, but that's where they come from. And what I found in my survey research is that I could make the scale more predictive if I added this fifth question, which is some groups are simply inferior to others. And it gets to what Karen Stenner talked about in her book, Groupiness, in-group versus out-group identification. And you can see this today, this in-group, MAGA. I'm a MAGA person, you're not. I don't wear a mask, you do. It's in-group versus out-group identification. So that question took all my survey work, especially in Europe, where we've been doing this, but also in the United States, and made the questions more predictive of authoritarian behaviors.
What's interesting is George Lakoff wrote a book, if you're familiar with Lakoff, he wrote a book, one of his early books, before he became like the guru of wordsmithing and of framing. He wrote a book that described politics. And in that book, I think it was written in the late 90s, he basically described the parenting style of conservatives and of liberals. And really what you're describing is almost exactly what he's describing. He talks about strict parenting turns people into conservatives, and nurturing parenting turns people into liberals. And that's, the questions you're asking directly are connected to that.
Yeah, and you're spot on with Lakoff, the strict parent, patriarchal, authority wielding, strong father. And I would use strong with quotes around it because I don't think that's strong fathering. Yeah. But the effect of that and how that leads to, he would say a conservative outlook, but it's more than that. It's an authoritarian outlook.
And so that there's a very close tie between conservatism and authoritarianism.
Yeah, they can be tied, but they're also different. And you see this within the Republican Party. And the Lincoln Project people who are breaking away from Trump right now. They're economic conservatives versus the social Tea Party, but beyond Tea Party, authoritarians.
So they're libertarians.
Yeah. And, we saw this in the first poll. That's a good point. The first poll I did in late 2015, I was trying to figure out who supports Trump. Are they authoritarians? My theory was probably authoritarians. And I was just looking at Republican voters in the Republican primaries, nationally, and then South Carolina. And Trump's support was authoritarian. But those authoritarian Republicans didn't support any of the other candidates statistically. And
so that might explain a question I just saw today on the news, asking the guy running against in South Carolina for Senate, Jamie, I can't think of his last name.
Jamie Harrison running against Lindsey Graham. Yeah.
Lindsey Graham, yeah. They ask him, why would people support Trump and then vote for you? And maybe you just gave the answer to that.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's right. I think they will split their vote because of how they view Lindsey Graham. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. So we need to take a brief break for show ID and 20 seconds of silence, and then we'll be right back. And my guest for this show is Matthew Mcwilliams. He's an expert on authoritarianism and the author of the book on fascism, 12 Lessons for American History. His website is MatthewMcWilliams.com, M-A-C Williams. So you have, you basically, your book is a collection of American horror stories, true horror stories of justice, horror stories of hate and intolerance. And when you take a close look at them, it's shameful and horrific. It's monstrosities, really. So I'm going to pick one, and then you'll pick one. Okay. So talk about our President Jackson and what he did, and what happened in that story.
Oh, that's the story of the Treaty of New Echota. And it led to the Trail of Tears, but really the removal not just of Cherokee, but Indians across the country. And the basis of it was the Indian Removal Act. And what Jackson wanted to do, there was, I write about as the American Lebensraum, meaning we were taking land that we needed to grow as a country. And we are taking that land.
But where does Lebensraum come from? Is that like what Nazi Germany did?
Exactly.
Okay.
That was part of the theory of growth, that Nazi Germany needed room to grow, and so it could take land from others to grow German culture.
And just so a little more background, the Cherokees had signed treaties that had been ratified by Congress, and then in Georgia, these treaties were totally ignored, and all of the government was ignoring the treaties, and there was no protection for anybody.
Absolutely. We had signed treaties. I think we had signed 19 treaties with the Cherokees and broken each one of them. And then finally, Jackson really wanted to remove Cherokee, but other Native tribes. I focused on the Cherokee, wanted to remove them to Indian country. And he was going to do it any way possible. And he did it through the Indian Removal Act, passed by Congress barely. And then...
But wait, you need to throw in a little bit more, because you tell in the book about how Jackson promised it would be done humanely.
Oh, yeah. He was spinning, Rob. He said it will be done humanely. At the same time, he was preparing to just move them out. First, get them to sign a new treaty that gave up their land. And then second, to send them to Oklahoma, a place they'd never been to before, with really no possessions at all. All their possessions were gone. And the key thing about the Cherokee, and one of the great concerns about the Cherokee, and Calhoun, Secretary of State, was very worried that the Cherokee were becoming really acculturated to the United States. They had their own constitution. They had a newspaper. They were settled. They had homes.
They had representation.
Yes.
Their own government.
They had their own government. They had their chief, which we totally ignored. And so the act was passed, the Indian Removal Act. Jackson sent in someone to get a treaty with the Cherokee. The Chief Ross would not sign it, so they negotiated with a splinter group that was not elected to represent the Cherokee. They brought the fraudulent treaty back to the Senate. The Senate agreed to it, and the Cherokee had 2 years to leave. And at the end of the 2 years, very few Cherokee had left. So forces were sent in, military was sent in to forcibly remove them from their homes. And some of the, quotes of people who, were doing their job as soldiers about what happened during this removal, or just churns your stomach. But it didn't just happen to Cherokee, it happened across Native Americans.
Now, when you say it churns your stomach, the reason that it does is because how horribly these people were treated, getting violently, aggressively, brutally thrown out of their homes. Women were just taken out of homes that were actually nice homes. They didn't live
Yeah.
in teepees. They lived in
Nice
comfortable
homes.
homes.
And everything left behind. I mean, it is similar to what happened to a lot of Japanese Americans with Japanese internment camps. How, in the book, there is I tell through the eyes of George Takei, little kid. He's at his home with his parents, and a soldier comes to the door and knocks on the door, and they're removed from their home. And their home is left there, is left open.
Yes. And
Same
we now
here.
know that the Japanese internment, which was supported by the Supreme Court, Korematsu decision, was it?
Right.
Was based on fraudulent lying testimony that left out key information that would have probably changed the decision. So instead of a couple thousand of Japanese who were identified as high risk, 120,000 Japanese were interned in the camps.
Exactly. And here with the Cherokee, they were forcibly removed and not allowed to come back. And that land was then taken. Supposedly property rights are important to this part of our system of government. Their property, according to U.S. treaties with them, because they were a sovereign nation, was just expropriated. The Supreme Court said you can't do this. But the Supreme Court couldn't enforce that, and Jackson said, "You can't enforce it. I'll do whatever I want." So it's a really awful story, but one that's critically important for people to realize and to understand. And it wasn't just the Cherokee; there are others. I focused on the Cherokee in the story.
And you have a dozen examples. That's one.
Yes.
And these are powerful examples of how fascism by authoritarians has happened, has been perpetrated in the worst ways in the United States. And many of them remind us, they echo or reverberate in what we see with Donald Trump.
Yes, absolutely. It is. And what's really interesting, Rob, I think, is what portrait did Trump put up in the Oval Office? It was a portrait of Andrew Jackson.
Yeah. Inspired by
who,
one of the most monstrous presidents in American history.
Yeah.
Total racist.
Total racist, and not disguised at all.
Yeah. Now, another one I'd like you to talk about is the Palmer raids, because there you've got progressives who became fascists.
Well, I'm not hearing you.
No?
Oh, progressives who became fascists. Did you?
Yes. The Palmer
Yeah,
raids.
Yeah, A. Mitchell Palmer. This was the Wilson administration. A. Mitchell Palmer was a Quaker congressman from Pennsylvania. He was named Attorney General by Wilson, and he took office. And as he took office, there was domestic terrorism going on. In fact, on May Day, I think this is 1919, there were a series of bombs that exploded around the country. One right at A. Mitchell Palmer's home. So there was fear in the country about domestic terrorism. It was communism that people were scared of that was supposedly driving it. And what A. Mitchell Palmer did, how he responded to this, was looking at it as a political opportunity. He wanted to run for president. And he wanted to run, and this is interesting and given today, on a law and order platform. So A. Mitchell Palmer got together with the new head of one of the departments in what would become the FBI, and that head was a young man named J. Edgar Hoover, and came up with a scheme to do what were called Palmer raids. And the Palmer raids, first they tested them in the November of the year. And what they did is they just did sweeps of people of Russian descent or just immigrants. They would go in with police, federal agents, and also people from the American Protective League, vigilantes, and arrest people. But they didn't arrest them. The one that I start the story out is the story of Michael Lavovsky, who was a teacher at the Russian House in New York City. Well, they didn't just arrest people, they came in and beat them. He tells the story, and it's written actually, his story is testimony that was given from him and used to unseat or to stop Palmer raids and to stop the whole thing. But, they went in, he was teaching, they hit him over the head, knocked off his glasses, hit him over the head, dragged him out of the room, threw him down the stairs as they threw tens of hundreds of people in Russian House, down the stairs, out the door, beaten, taken to the police department with, there was no warrant for these people. It was just a way of spreading fear, basically.
But this guy was a progressive.
Yeah, he was a progressive, but he, that's what's fascinating about it, because authoritarianism can be progressive, it can be on the right. He was progressive, but he wanted to run as a law and order candidate. There was the fear that was spread of communism, and he was going to do something about the red fear of communism. Now, what happened then, that was the test in November. They did that in 3 or 4 cities. They did a nationwide sweep in early January, arresting thousands of people. And they didn't.
He might have described those people as super predators.
He might have super predators, or he might have just called them commies.
But isn't super predators what Joe Biden called people when he was pushing that legislation?
Oh no, he would say he never did. I don't think he actually said that. I think that was ascribed to him. But
okay.
In the end, what happened is he made Law and Order, Palmer, part of his presidential campaign, and he predicted in May 1st, this is 2020, that there was going to be this gigantic raid. And in the end, it wasn't just Palmer. The press was all behind this too. The Washington Post was supporting it, saying, "Great work, Palmer." And he built up this expectation that on May 1st, there was going to be this gigantic revolution that would have to be put down. And May 1st came and went, and nothing happened. And that just, the air went right out of his campaign, and his ability to act extra legally, unconstitutionally as he had.
But he ended up creating a monster with J. Edgar Hoover. How many years later was that Hoover took over the FBI?
I think it was maybe a decade later. And that's the key point in the book. The lesson learned: you just can't remove the top person who was pushing for this, Mitchell Palmer. You have to also go down to the enablers. And J. Edgar Hoover was an enabler. He was part of it, and he needed to be removed, not promoted. And he was promoted. And we'll have the same thing if, there's a change of administration coming up. We'll have the same thing here. The enablers cannot be allowed to stay.
Now, that was something I meant to get to, because I usually think of, you've got the person who tells people what to do and the people who want to be told what to do, but you've added the enablers.
Right.
So talk some more about, what are they? What are the enablers? Who are they?
Well, I think the easiest way to look at it is what's going on right now. There's Trump, but then there are all these people around him who enable his actions. Attorney General Barr allowing the Justice Department to be used politically. Department of Homeland Security separating children from parents at the border. You can go through the list of people who work in the administration who have not stood up and said no. What happens is those who say no, their heads go off. They're fired. But the new DNI, who came out just yesterday or day before yesterday and said the Iranian attack was actually in support of Biden, twisting reality to fit Trump's view of it. So these are people who are sycophants, they're enablers, their power comes from his. And so they join in and they take the authoritarian leader and expand his power. It's a very, it's a dangerous crew to leave. You know, we left, J. Edgar Hoover was left at what became the FBI, and look what he turned into.
Yeah, really. Okay, so
Can I mention one other of the stories that to me is the,
absolutely, yeah.
this was a story that quite literally brought tears to my eyes, because I thought I knew this history and I didn't. And it's a history of lynching in this country. And, you know, Mark Twain wrote an essay called The United States of Lyncherdom. And that's how Mark Twain saw what was going on and how he described it. And he was right. And this, we have to confront this legacy because, you know, it's slavery, Missouri Compromise, Dred Scott, you know, it's all lynching, George Floyd. There is a through line here that we haven't dealt with. And the things that really disturbed me so was the extent of lynching, which I didn't know and I should have. And that it was really used as a tool by whites to terrorize Black Americans.
Well, talk about the extent. What do we need to know that we don't know?
From 1882 to 1968, 4,742 Americans were murdered by mob violent lynching. And it wasn't just in the South. It crossed the Mason-Dixon line, but it was more in the South than in the North. And we know these descriptions. We know that this happened because people wrote about it. There's this former slave who became a journalist. Her name is Ida B. Wells. Some of her books here, just the covers of them would turn your stomach, but she cataloged them. And these were not private events. Some of these were mass gatherings. That's why it was really state-sponsored terrorism. So in Paris, Texas, 10,000 people watched as, and this is Ida B. Smith writing, Ida B. Wells writing, Henry Smith was placed on a scaffold, securely bound, tortured for 50 minutes by red-hot iron brands, thrust against his quivering body, placed against him inch by inch until they were thrust against his face. Then kerosene was poured on him, cottonseed hulls were placed beneath him, and he was set on fire. 10,000 people watched that event. These events, some of them, I mean, it's just incredible. In Ellisville, Mississippi, the Daily Jackson News promoted a lynching like it was a sporting event. On its front page, it said, quote, John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville mob at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Governor says he's powerless to prevent it. But the thing that got me, I mean, the stories are incredible. But the thing that really got me is that to this day in the United States of America, we do not have a federal anti-lynching bill. It has never passed both the House and Senate and been signed by the president. How is that possible?
Well, tie this back into fascism and authoritarianism.
Well, it's terrorism. And so it's white power terrorizing Blacks to keep them, because Black Americans were the other. We wanted to keep them in the place. Some groups are inferior to others. You know, the Dred Scott decision, Taney's thing, that Blacks were inferior. It was a way to maintain power over African Americans after the Civil War. And lynching was the tool.
I was interested about that Taney decision because that happened while Lincoln was around. And what you tell, that's an interesting story that I was not aware of, was Lincoln versus Douglas running for the Senate. Lincoln won the popular vote and lost because it went to the state Congress. And just like what happened with George W. Bush and Donald Trump.
Exactly. You know, that was before the 17th Amendment, the Constitution. So senators were elected by state legislators. And, the majority in the state, majority of people in the state of Illinois voted Republican for Republican state legislators, but there was gerrymandering. So Democrats had a majority in the state house.
And the
So
Democrats supported slavery,
yep.
and Lincoln, as a Republican, was totally opposed to it.
Yeah. And, and he, even before the 1858 race, Lincoln wrote that, he was anti-slavery. He couldn't tell you why, but it was core to his being that he was anti-slavery.
But he was also a racist.
Yeah, but if I had given him the authoritarian test, he would have scored low on the authoritarian test.
But and the reason I say he was a racist is because, as your book, I learned in your book, he said that all men were created equal in terms of the right to the pursuit of happiness and
yes.
those aspects, but that they were not created equal in terms of other things like intelligence and what have you.
Yeah, he was a creature of his time, and he was very enlightened for his time because he supported the Declaration of Independence, equality, but he also saw that it was equal in very specific ways, but not others. But he knew slavery was wrong. I mean, he said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. And he also, I think this is a key part of American history, he was aspirational. To Lincoln, equality was an aspiration, something he talked about in his writing, something to be looked for and labored for. And I think he thought over time that if you look for it and labor for it, eventually we will have equality of the races. He just didn't think they were equal at that time.
Okay, we need to take another break, and then
Sure.
we'll be back to get it. I want to find out about the work you're doing outside the U.S. fighting fascism.
Oh, thank you. Happy to talk.
So, little 20-second rest here. And my guest for the show is Matthew Mcwilliams, who's an expert on authoritarianism and the author of the book on fascism, 12 Lessons from American History. His website is MatthewMcWilliams.com. So you're doing work now helping in other countries to fight fascism. What does that look like? What do you do? How do you do it?
Well, first, we want to understand what was happening. This is specifically in Europe and some in Eurasia. But we want to understand specifically what was happening. We saw the rise of right-wing parties in countries like Italy, Spain, Denmark, the Netherlands, Gerd Wilders in the Netherlands. France, the growth of what was National Front is now National Rally, Marine Le Pen. And so the critique at that point, the analysis was these are populist parties and they're driving populism is what is attracting voters to them. And my question was, is it really populism? Because if we don't diagnose the problem right, we can't solve it. So we did a series first of surveys in these countries where we have questions that predict a person's disposition of populism, hostile sexism, racism, authoritarianism, a whole bunch of different isms. And then we looked at how they were voting. And what we found was that the parties that were really moving very right-wing and authoritarian messages were backed not by populists, but by authoritarians. So example, in Italy, this was 2 years ago, there were two parties that were competing. There were more than that, but there were two primaries. One, the Five Star Movement, which is Beppe Grillo, the comedian, and the League was called the Northern League. Now it's called the League. That's Matteo Salvini. And what we found is that populists supported the Five Star Movement. Now, the five-star movement wants more democracy. They want online democracy. They are real populists. Matteo Salvini was supported by authoritarians. And one of the key differences between authoritarians and populists are populists want more democracy, and they're more likely to support democracy, as you would expect in surveys. Authoritarians, they do not like democracy. We have a 5-question battery that measures their support for democracy. And the more authoritarian you are, the less likely you are to support democracy. And so this movement that we saw, really, we've seen across Europe, including in Germany, would be the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, is an authoritarian movement, not a populist movement. And that has real implications for policy, for how you deal with them. And if you make, if you invite them into your tent and make a coalition with them. There's a great book, it's back on my shelves here, How Democracies Die. And it says, democracies die when they invite authoritarian parties into coalition with them. And if you do that, we see this in the United States, where Trumpists were invited into the Republican Party. That is one of the biggest warning signs for democracy dying. And so knowing that these parties that we're looking at in Europe are not pro-democracy, that they're anti-democracy, helps the other parties that are there understand that they shouldn't form in coalition with them. So at the macro level, the top down level, should parties work together? No, if you're in Germany, you should not, as Angela Merkel's party, work with AfD, because AfD is going to take you in a place you don't want to go.
So Joe Biden talks about bringing in Republicans as part of his administration. Not a good idea.
Well, I think if they're real Republicans and not Trumpists, but I wouldn't bring a Trumpist in to any discussion if Biden wins. It's the same as allowing J. Edgar Hoover to stay there. No. Right. The Lincoln Project is a great example of reasonable Republicans who are shocked and dismayed by what Trump is doing, and they've been fighting him. But then there are the enablers in the Senate, and you can name them as well as I can, who have just rolled over time and time again. I mean, the question is really, what do you do with the Senate? With all these Republicans who just sold out to Trump because they were scared of him and didn't stand up for their oath of office, which is to protect our democracy.
Yeah, they sure haven't. That's ouch. So how do you profile and identify people who are populists? Do you have questions that identify them?
Yeah, there used to be a battery of 8 questions. We've got it down to 5 questions. But they're questions that, unlike these child-rearing questions, they're ones that look at the popular will of people. Do elites control government and not pay attention to you? Do you feel listened to or not? So they're different than the authoritarian questions, but they're highly predictive of someone having a populist disposition or wanting a populist party.
Okay, so what are you doing there? You mentioned to me before we started you working in Spain.
Yeah, I'm working in Spain with a group of people to take what we've learned from the polling and the focus groups and put it into action. And the group are people who live in Spain, and they're taking this fight online. And that's the key, because where a lot of the authoritarian parties are playing is online, and they're spreading fear and hate online. And they've done it with COVID-19. It's been very, very, so you blame the government for COVID-19. You say that the government can't do anything, that it's fear, and we need a real new strong leader to take and do the work that needs to be done in COVID-19. So instead of we're all in this together, we can solve this by working together and by wearing masks and doing things. It's more everyone for themselves, and join our group, and we're going to make sure that we're safe, and we're going to fight the government for making us do things.
So they're fighting distancing or curfews and requirements to wear masks.
Everything we see here in the United States is being replicated in Europe. And, there was a great ad that was just done in Germany on this by the government. And it's an older woman giving, it's an older woman tight like this, and she has her middle finger up, which I won't do. And it basically says, wear a mask, exclamation point. So it's, for Germany, it's a really hot ad. And it's for the people who are saying, we're all in this together. And this woman's life's on the line if you don't wear a mask, so wear a mask. So there's that side. And then there's the other side, which is basically saying, government's a wreck. It can't do anything to protect you, herd immunity, basically.
Yeah, let lots of people die.
Yeah, let lots of people die, but we'll be fine. We're going to be fine, but let lots of people die. And what these parties, the party in Spain is Vox, they're using it to build fear and build support. They're using that fear to drive people to them. Before then, it was immigration that they were using. Now they're using COVID-19.
So what do you do? What are your strategies to counter them?
Well, we developed the messages that are really, they're bottom-up messages. From your book there, that you go through a lot of the contrast. It's empathy. It is how working together, it's unity. It's not division. It's how if we work together, we can solve this. We're all in this together. So we develop messages like that and then move them online. And we have organizations who pick up the messages and repeat them online. And so instead of just this hateful online diatribe from the right, there's a countervailing message of unity, working together, taking care of each other, and doing what's necessary to fight a pandemic that really doesn't care if we're right or left. It's just out to kill whoever it can.
I've encountered a decent amount of people on the left who are into this whole thing. Masks don't work, or they kill you, or this is all a plot to take over the world. And it's really been hard for me to understand it.
It's the problem. I think extremes provoke extremes, and we need, for this country, we need a set of facts that people agree on, and that we base policy and politics on. And these crazy nutball ideas like masks don't work. How many scientists do you have to listen to come to the conclusions that they do work? It's like global warming. When I was listening to the debate on climate change last night, scientists agree climate change is happening, and it's a big problem. We shouldn't be having a debate if it's happening or not. It's how we solve it.
Yeah.
But on the left and the right, you see conspiracy theories, and part of this is it's probably the next book I work on, if I ever get to that point, Rob. I don't know if I will. It's about the digital world and how it is just the algorithms that favor clickbait is changing the way that we perceive the world and really lighting the fires of extremism around the world. It's not just, the United States, it's around the world. You see it in Europe. In Europe, you also have state-sponsored attacks. I mean, Russia's very active. We think they're active here. In Europe, they are extremely active online.
So we're down to a couple minutes, and I wanted to cover a couple more things. One is another one of the horror stories to talk about is the Sedition Act, and how that was used to totally silence any criticism of the president or the government by the media, and it ended up resulting in arrest and imprisonment of publishers and editors.
Yes.
And what really caught my attention with that is that was based on the Federalists. And we have a candidate for the Supreme Court Amy Coney Barrett, who is a Federalist. And so we could expect perhaps that the Sedition Act might come back, that total blocking of the media and criticism could come back.
Well, you know, the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798 sunset in 1801, but there's another Alien and Sedition Act that was passed in World War I, and it's still around. And you read this and you go, you look at the law that comes out of that act and you go, really? This is going on? And I think it is your insights into Amy Coney Barrett and linking it to it's very interesting, because what happened was the Federalists were about to lose control to the Democrat Republicans, Jefferson, basically.
Well, they did.
Well, in 1798 they were about to. So they passed this Alien and Sedition Act to try to, you know, stop criticism of the president. And basically, what it was, if you criticize the president, you could be jailed.
Were jailed.
Yeah. And so Matthew Lyon, a congressman from Vermont, was one. Thomas Cooper is the one I focus on because he was an editor. Jefferson called him one of the greatest men in America. And his trial, which was presided over by one of the Supreme Court members, Chase, who was riding the circuit back then, they used to ride the circuit, was just a ridiculous exercise in Banana Republic judicial
and now we got like a minute left, and you finished the book talking about Pogo was wrong and 10 steps to strengthen America. So give me a 1-minute version of that.
Now, there are 3 things we got to do. There are 10 points in there, and 5 of them are Madison's, which if you read them, you'll realize that Madison was almost a socialist. He talks about political equality, economic equality. He would be called a socialist today. But they're his writings and they're spot on. But there are 3 things we need to do. Personally, we got to stop bothering each other. It's hard, but we cannot. There is no enemy within. We have to work with our authoritarian neighbors to come to consensus. Institutionally, we got to have a set of facts, and we have to put the guardrails of democracy back up, and we have to demand that our institutions do their job. They're not doing their job right now. The institutions have failed us. And then socially, and I think this is the most important one of all, we got to make peace with our history. The history in this book, the only one that we've made peace with, we still don't have an anti-lynching act. We should pass one. There's one sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. He won't bring it, right? We have to make peace with our history. And the only peace we've made is Japanese internment. We have done reparations and we've reconciled with Japanese Americans. And it was Ronald Reagan who signed that bill, reconciling with Japanese Americans. There's a lot of things about Ronald Reagan I don't agree with. It's pretty amazing he did that. So we got to take action to those 3 things.
We got to wrap now.
All right.
It's been a great interview. Thank you so much. My guest has been Matthew C. McWilliams. His book on Fascism, 12 Lessons from American History. Fabulous read, fascinating and important. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Rob. Thanks for the great questions. Have a good day.